Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Welcome to the 18th episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie. And today on the podcast, we have another excellent question from a listener. So let's go ahead and listen to her question.
Hi, I am extremely intolerant to casein and whey, so I cannot eat dairy. I'm wondering what you can tell me what to eat to help me get my calcium requirements. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that question. That is such a good one, and it is a question that I get very, very often, and so I definitely had to tackle it on the podcast. So thank you again for sending us that question. So I definitely wanted to start with, why is calcium so important for kidney stones? I know this is a topic that I cover what feels like endlessly, both on the podcast and in my other content on social media and on the blog and all of the things, but it is so important, and it feels very counterintuitive. So I wanted to definitely take just a couple minutes to explain why calcium is important and why, if you are listening to me for the first time, like, why is this person asking about calcium? Because unfortunately, the message that people who have calcium stones shouldn't eat a lot of calcium is still out there. And this is actually very harmful and wildly incorrect advice. If your doctor or dietitian or someone else told you to avoid calcium because you have calcium stones. And I know that is very counterintuitive, so let's dive into that a little bit more. So people who have calcium stones, primarily calcium oxalate stones, actually want to make sure that they're getting in enough calcium, primarily because calcium does a massive thing to oxalate in the gut. So basically, when you eat enough calcium or you eat calcium with your meals, it inhibits how much oxalate gets absorbed into your body. So less oxalate gets absorbed into your body when you eat enough calcium. And then that oxalate, of course, just gets excreted in your feces. It just gets pooped out of your body, as opposed to that oxalate being absorbed into your body, being processed, and getting excreted in your urine, which is where it can increase the risk of stones. And so we see in study after study a massive reduction in kidney stone risk when people are eating diets that are adequate in calcium. So that is reason number one why we really want people with calcium stones to be getting enough calcium, is because of that reduced absorption of oxalate. The other big thing is bone health. And I know you might be thinking, like, gosh, Melanie, we're talking about kidney stones. Why are you talking about bone health? And the reason is because there's a huge connection. So we know that people who have calcium stones definitely have a higher risk of bone fracture and bone disease, things like osteopenia, osteoporosis. And so it's really, really important that you're getting that calcium, both for reducing oxalate absorption as well as just for your bones and to help keep them healthy. So that is why Lisa was asking us this question about dairy. And why, how can she get in her calcium? Because that calcium is really important for people who have calcium stones, especially people who have high urine oxalate, because getting in that calcium is going to help lower that oxalate absorption. And it's also really important counterintuitively for people who have high urine calcium, because that high urine calcium shows us that you may be at especially high risk of that bone disease. And so you really want to be actually eating enough calcium to protect your bones. So how do you get calcium? And this will move us into the answer to Lisa's question. So for most people, I do recommend dairy if you tolerate it and you are okay with consuming dairy. I definitely understand that there are lots of reasons why people might not eat dairy or choose to avoid dairy, religious reasons, ethical reasons, people who are intolerant, and all of these are completely legitimate, and I completely respect that. Obviously, I am not saying that everyone in the entire world needs to drink milk, but if you do like milk and you are okay with consuming it, I consume milk myself, that is what I recommend. So dairy is just a really, really great source of natural calcium, and later in the podcast, we'll talk a little bit more about calcium supplements and why it's so important to get that natural calcium. But dairy really is just one of the few foods that is a really, really good source of absorbable calcium. And so if you are okay with consuming it, that is why I recommend it so strongly for stones. And plus, we see in studies that people who consume dairy specifically have a lower risk of stones. Now, a lot of that probably is just because they're more likely to get inadequate calcium because that dairy is such a good source of calcium. But for whatever reason, we do see in studies that people who consume dairy and or consume adequate calcium have a lower risk of stones. So what do you do if you can't consume dairy for any of the above listed reasons or others? So for the intolerance piece, I think is probably the most common reason people are avoiding dairy. And for most people, the reason that they aren't tolerating dairy is the lactose, which is just the fancy name of the sugar, one of the sugars that's in milk. And I will say that yogurt and cheese specifically tend to have less lactose in them compared to milk, just because the process, the fermenting of the yogurt and the process of making cheese, the yogurt especially, has less lactose in it compared to milk. And so a lot of people who can't tolerate milk actually do okay and tolerate yogurt and or cheese. So that would be my first tip, is if you do want to try to stick to the dairy, try the yogurt and cheese first. If you have removed dairy from your diet for many, many years, maybe because someone on Instagram told you it was bad for you or whatever, maybe try yogurt and cheese first and kind of slowly incorporate it and work your way up. I will say also that if you haven't consumed dairy for a long period of time, and you try to add some back and you're having some tummy troubles, start with that yogurt and cheese, but also go slowly, right? So typically we recommend 3 servings of high calcium foods or dairy per day. That is what we recommend for stone prevention, and that's also actually what's recommended in the dietary guidelines for Americans. So sort of just like our recommendations for general health for people. So definitely don't go from eating 0 milk for years potentially to 3 servings a day. Like, that's just a big change to your diet, right? And you want to kind of slowly incorporate this. So maybe even starting with a half cup of milk a day and do that for a couple weeks. And when you feel good about that, increasing it to 1 cup and just kind of move with what feels right for you. And that can really, really help people with that lactose intolerance, if that is the reason that you are avoiding dairy. Now, of course, even with those tips, I completely understand that not everyone is going to be able to tolerate dairy, or you're avoiding it for other reasons. And so here is getting really to the meat and potatoes of my answer to Lisa's question. So my next recommendation, if you don't do dairy, is using plant-based milk substitutes. I think that these are a great option, and we are lucky enough to have a whole host of different options of these plant-based milk substitutes available to us. Of course, because these milk substitutes are made from plants, they do have some oxalate in them, because that is where oxalate is found. And we do have pretty big differences in how much oxalate is found in these different plant-based milks. There was actually an article that came out a couple years ago that accurately measured the oxalate content in a whole bunch of different versions of these plant-based milk substitutes. So that's a great resource. So I'm pulling all of these numbers from that article, and I'll link that article in the show notes to this episode. So the plant-based milks that do have higher oxalate in them are going to be almond milk. That one definitely sticks out above all the others at 27 milligrams of oxalate per cup. I will say that even that, though, that's not astonishingly high. For context, a half cup of cooked spinach has somewhere around 750 milligrams per half cup serving. So when we're talking about 27 milligrams per cup, it's not, that doesn't scare me. And of course, I would need to look at your 24-hour urine test to know for sure what's going to be the best option for you. But if you really love almond milk, I think there's definitely room to incorporate that or rotate that in as your calcium source, if that's something that you love. But I wanted to give that caveat as I'm just listing these numbers. But almond does come in as the highest oxalate option at that 27 milligrams of oxalate per cup. The other higher oxalate choices are cashew milk, around 17 milligrams of oxalate per cup, hazelnut milk at 11 milligrams per cup, and soy milk at 10 milligrams of oxalate per cup. So almond, cashew, hazelnut, and soy milk are going to be on the higher end when it comes to oxalate. On the flip side, the lower oxalate choices for these plant-based milks are coconut milk, which is my personal favorite. Like I said, I drink normal cow's milk for the vast majority of my calcium, but I do like to mix it up sometimes just for fun. Like, I think variety is the spice of life, and also variety is really important when it comes to getting adequate nutrition too. So sometimes I do dabble in some of these plant-based milk substitutes. So coconut milk is my personal favorite with 0 milligrams of oxalate per cup. And that's not why it's my favorite. It's my favorite just because I think it's delicious. But I do know that coconut is kind of a controversial flavor. I feel like coconut, you either love it or you hate it. I love it. My husband hates it. So it is not his first choice. But coconut milk is a great lower oxalate option. Flax milk also with 0 milligrams of oxalate per cup. Hemp milk at 5 milligrams of oxalate. Macadamia nut milk with 1 milligram of oxalate per cup. Oat milk is another really great option with 4 milligrams of oxalate per cup. And that one I wanted to highlight because I know that oat milk is really popular these days. It's very widely available. And so I think oat milk can be a really great option. Rice milk is another great one with only rice milk with only 1 milligram of oxalate per cup. And also, I wanted to point out that pea milk, that's not as common, but does exist. Pea milk wasn't unfortunately listed or measured as part of that study that I mentioned earlier, but because green peas are low in oxalate, we can safely assume that pea milk would also be likely very low in oxalate. So pea milk is another great option if you do need those lower oxalate choices. So as I always say, when it comes to, especially when I'm listing these specific oxalate numbers, I always want to give the caveat that I never recommend that anyone count the amount of oxalate that you consume, because we simply don't have a good way to give you a goal of oxalate for you to eat per day. Like when people say eating 50 milligrams of oxalate per day or 100 milligrams of oxalate per day, all of that is made up. And there's really no published like what a low oxalate diet should be. And honestly, it's going to be very, very different for all of us based on our 24-hour urine test. So I really don't recommend counting it because we don't have a good goal to give you. And also diligently counting and specifically counting oxalate like this is period impossible to do, period. There's no way for you to know exactly how much oxalate you're consuming for a wide variety of reasons. I should probably do a whole other podcast about that topic. And so I really, really discourage people from specifically counting oxalate because it's so difficult to do. It's so stressful. And 9.5 times out of 10, there are much, much bigger things to be focusing on in your diet when it comes to stone prevention than oxalate. So I just wanted to throw that out there, especially since I was giving these specific oxalate numbers. But I do think if you are thinking about incorporating some of these plant-based milk substitutes into your diet and you enjoy some of these lower oxalate choices, I would probably steer you towards those just because, we don't want to necessarily add another dose of oxalate to your diet if we don't need to. I'd much, much prefer you get oxalate from lots of healthy fruits and vegetables and beans and nuts and seeds. So, yes, so those are the best options when it comes to getting calcium without dairy is these plant-based milk substitutes. Again, those lower oxalate choices are going to be coconut, flax, hemp, macadamia nut, oat milk, rice milk, and also pea milk. I have a article on the blog that dives into all of these numbers and my other thoughts about plant-based milk substitutes and all these things, and so I will definitely link to that in the show notes as well. I did want to make a note that if you make your own plant-based milk at home, so if you are taking coconut or making your own almond milk or whatever it is that you're making at home, none of these things will be an especially good source of calcium because none of these foods are naturally high in calcium. So when you buy these things at the store, most of the time they are supplemented with calcium, which is how they become a good source of calcium. So I just wanted to give that caveat that if you are making your own milk at home, it's not going to be a good source of calcium. Another note is that a lot of times people say, well, Melanie, there's a lot of calcium in vegetables. Can I get my calcium from vegetables? And yes, you absolutely can. There's definitely calcium in vegetables. However, the calcium that is found in vegetables tends to not be absorbed nearly as well as what is found in dairy or these plant-based milk substitutes. primarily because the exact vegetables that are high in calcium also are high in oxalate. So I'm not saying that you can't eat these foods because they're higher in oxalate, but I'm saying these foods may not be the best option for getting your calcium in specifically, just because that oxalate is going to bind with a lot of that calcium, reducing the calcium bioavailability of those foods. So wanted to add that certainly you can get little bits of calcium from from a whole bunch of different fruits and vegetables, broccoli, spinach, Swiss chard, lots of different things. But really, that calcium is just so important for stone formers. I feel so strongly that people with high urine oxalate or high urine calcium get in that calcium to reduce stone risk and protect your bones. I want to be absolutely certain that you are getting in enough calcium. And when you are doing that with dairy or these plant-based milk substitutes, I feel very confident that your body is absorbing that calcium and it's doing what it needs to do in your body for your health. And when we're relying exclusively on those vegetables for calcium for stone formers, it makes me a little nervous. So you're probably going to get a different answer on that angle from different dietitians. That's just my personal take. And I will say that it could be different for different people, right? Based on your kidney function or other medical history, or how significant your stone history is. My answer might be different for you, but as a general rule, I'd much prefer we get calcium from dairy or these plant-based milk substitutes. The last thing I wanted to comment on this episode, or in this episode, was calcium supplements, because I get this question all the time, right? They think, all right, Melanie, like you need calcium. I get it. Why can't I just take a pill? Which is fair, because honestly, getting in all of this calcium 3 times a day, 3 servings of whether it's milk or these milk substitutes or whatever it is a lot. Like, not gonna lie, having some milk or cheese with every meal can get old. This is actually the reason I created 2 of my cookbooks, Stop Kidney Stones from Your Kitchen. The whole point of all of the recipes in those cookbooks is to add dairy to the recipes, so it doesn't feel like you're just drinking milk with every meal. Again, there's nothing wrong with just having a glass of milk with every meal. Some people are totally cool with that, but I, as a foodie, really, really value and need variety in my meals. And so just having that glass of milk kind of got really boring, or having that cup of yogurt. And so the whole point of the recipes in my cookbooks is to incorporate the dairy into the recipes themselves. So that milk is in the soup, or that yogurt is incorporated into a sauce that you put on your salmon, or whatever it is. I will also link in the show notes to those cookbooks if you're interested in checking those out. So the reason it is so important to be getting in those 3 servings of dairy per day is because for the vast majority of people with calcium stones or with kidney stones, we really want to be avoiding calcium supplements. And I know that's, again, to make this even more counterintuitive, you're saying, all right, Melanie, like calcium in milk is good and in almond milk is okay, but in supplements it's bad. Like, what in the world are you saying? Bear with me. Let me explain myself a little bit. So the reason that calcium supplements aren't so great is that because calcium supplements, especially when we take them not with food, so when we take those supplements in between meals, they tend to increase the amount of calcium that's in our urine a whole lot more than the calcium from natural food sources does. So let me say that again. So calcium supplements, especially when we take them away from meals, increase urine calcium a whole lot more than naturally occurring calcium does. And that's a real big deal, because high urine calcium is actually the biggest driver of kidney stones for most people. Most people are making kidney stones not because they have high urine oxalate, but because they have high urine calcium. And so these calcium supplements make that situation worse. And we actually see in large studies that calcium supplements in general are associated with a higher risk of kidney stones, whereas calcium from dairy, or people who consume dairy, have a lower risk of kidney stones. And so that is why for the vast majority of people, we really want to avoid calcium supplements and really get that calcium in from natural food sources as much as we possibly can. There are definitely some exceptions, and there's, I think, definitely a place for calcium supplements for some people with kidney stones, most notably if you have kidney stones as a result of bariatric surgery or inflammatory bowel disease, so like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. You're forming stones for a very different reason. primarily because your body is sort of over absorbing oxalate, and so likely that calcium in your urine isn't a concern like it is for most other people with kidney stones. And in that case, I do think that calcium supplements can be really, really helpful. But again, these are very specific cases, and for the vast majority of people, taking those calcium supplements really isn't ideal, and we really want to be getting that calcium from actual food whenever we can. Now, everything that I just said about calcium supplements often begs the question, or people often ask me, well, Melanie, how in the world is it different that you are telling me that I can't take a calcium supplement pill, but it's okay to take these fortified plant-based milk substitutes? Because that's basically like taking a supplement, right? Like I just told you that all of these plant-based milk substitutes are fortified with calcium because if you make them at home, they're not going to be high in calcium. And I don't have a great answer for you. The only answer that I have is that I can say that clinically, working with stone formers for 7+ years now, we tend to not see the large spikes in urine calcium with those fortified plant-based milks as we do with supplements. There is no data, unfortunately, no research that has looked at the difference in urine calcium between, say, milk and fortified plant-based milk substitutes and calcium supplement pills. So I don't know, we can't say for sure, but I can say that I tend to not see urine calcium spike like I do when people are taking calcium supplements. But that is one of the reasons why I do sort of recommend dairy first whenever we can, just because we know that it's not going to raise that urine calcium. A couple of times I have seen urine calcium go up. I think it's been because people were taking these plant-based milk substitutes, but the vast majority of times I don't see that. And again, that calcium is so important for so many stone formers. Truly, if you have high urine oxalate, if you've had a 24-hour urine test and your urine oxalate comes back high, 8 times out of 10, people get in enough calcium. They make sure that it's with those meals so that calcium is really doing its work to reduce that oxalate absorption. And 8 times out of 10, urine oxalate comes tumbling down, and we don't need to worry about how much oxalate you're eating. Yes, maybe we want to avoid like the super big ones like spinach and beets and almonds. But other than that, generally, the oxalate thing doesn't stress me out because calcium is so good at reducing oxalate absorption and getting that urine oxalate down. So I hope that answers your question, Lisa. I know that was probably a lot more information than what you were looking for, but I have to be very thorough with my answers always and try to be as helpful as possible. So with that, I will close this episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. If you would like to submit a question for a chance to get answered on the podcast, please do. I'm always looking for good questions. There is a link in the show notes for how to submit those questions to me. With that, I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.